Hello, cult hackers, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Celine, a media graduate with an interest in cults.
And I'm her dad. I'm Stephen Mather. I'm trained as an organisational psychologist. I work in business doing training, but I'm also very interested in cults because I was raised in one and I left when I was about 30 when you were born, Celine.
Very succinct. We are good at this now.
It's only taken us 3 years in November. 3 years next month, Celine, is our birthday. Mm-hmm. Exciting stuff. Okay, so today we're doing a bit of a psychological one. We're looking at the psychology of cults in a bit more detail. And we're going to cover a topic that we've threatened to talk about a lot. And we've name dropped it a bit.
I felt like we've already done this. So when you said about it, I was just like, oh, we've already done this, surely. But I know that you would have checked that. It's the prison experiment.
Right. So we have kind of on a very high level mentioned it and just sort of in passing, but I've been quite hesitant to get into a deep dive on it. It's
why?
For a number of reasons.
Please highlight the reasons.
Please highlight the reasons, yes. Yeah. So it's quite a controversial study. It's become more controversial fairly recently.
I didn't realise it was controversial. I thought it was just known as a bit of a dodgy one. Do you know what I mean? Like everyone was a bit like, I thought it was the quintessential, look what they used to do back in the day. And that was as controversial as it was. I didn't realise there was controversy around it.
Yeah, so ethically, obviously, there's some issues with it. And but in terms of the actual science, it's another one of those. But I suppose, slightly tricky bit is Zimbardo is, I would say, in modern parlance, he's a bit of an ally when it comes to cult work and so on. So, he's actually worked with some people that we know, and he talks about cults, and he's pretty aligned with where we are on this topic, and so it's one of these slightly uncomfortable situations where you find yourself somebody that you actually really agree with in a lot of ways, but you have kind of problems with the actual work that he's done. So yeah, let's get into it because I think it's a really important study. It's called the Stanford Prison Experiment, which most people who've got any interest in psychology, have taken any courses on psychology, will probably have heard about it or will have read about it. If you've ever listened to podcasts about psychology or read a book, an introduction, it's always in there.
If it's like wildest experiments to have ever happened, it's in this number one on the list.
Yeah, exactly, and it sort of comes round and round over and over again. So let's quickly go through it in terms of what the actual experiment was. Just before that, though, I think the thing that I find interesting about this experiment is it actually raises so many questions that I find absolutely fascinating, and they are very, very relevant to cults. So it is very relevant to the question of cults and coercive control. So here I just thought about some sort of binaries, I suppose, in terms of what the issues are that this piece of work raises. So questions of individual responsibility versus group responsibility and effect on individuals. Who's accountable, I suppose, is one of the questions for behaviour. Situational versus individual psychology. So, yeah, is it really all about the person or is it really about the situation or the systems? Questions around the scientific method versus popularization of psychology and storytelling, I suppose. Evil, is there such thing as evil? And if there is such thing as evil, what is it? So all of these questions are wrapped up in this study. And I'll just give a quick brief overview. I've written a few notes down, so I'll try to sort of give it a quick overview. Now, my references from this are mainly from my study books from my degree. So this was for my psychology degree. Again, Zimbardo is in the first book you study. But even back then, it was still considered to be, there's lots of questions raised about it. And, so it's not like only recently has this been a problematic study. So it's always been one of those that people have criticised, or at least for quite some time. So basically, Zimbardo, he was in his 30s, so a fairly young professor at Stanford, just given tenure. And he puts a call out for students at Stanford to take part in a study about prison life. He gets more than 70 applicants reply to this, and they whittle it down to 24 people. They do some psychological tests, some psychometric tests, and they do some interviews to try to whittle out anybody that's had any mental health problems or has any history of psychopathy or anything like that. They offer to pay the participants $15 a day for doing this experiment. So this is going back to the 70s. So it's around $100 worth a day in today's currency, I suppose. So it's not loads of money, but it's quite unusual to pay participants that sort of money for a study. It was planned to last 2 weeks, but it was stopped after 6 days. And what they did is they took half of those applicants or those participants and they randomly selected them as prison guards, and the other half, they were prisoners. So they randomly selected for these half prison guards, half were prisoners. They converted the basement of one of the buildings at Stanford into what looked like a prison with 3 cells, 3 prisoners in each cell. Within 36 hours, one prisoner began suffering from acute emotional disturbances, or at least seemed to, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying and rage because of the situation he was in, and so on it went. He talks about this himself, so you can read his own transcripts and you can listen to it. He's talked about this on interviews and so on. For the prisoners, he had an arrangement with the local sheriff or one of the law enforcement departments to go round to the house of these students who were going to be the prisoners. They didn't know this was going to happen. They knew they were signed up to this experiment, but they didn't know this was going to happen. The police turned up at their door, stormed in, put them in handcuffs, accused them of some drug trafficking offences or charged them with something, and or arrested them over something, and bundled them in their car, took them into prison, and that's when it began. And from that moment on, then they were the prisoners. Very little. They couldn't go out. They had no exercise, and so on. They were stuck in these prisons, and then the prisoners, the prison guards, were there to look after, in inverted commas, them, and so on. After 6 days, so very quickly, one of these people ends up having to be released, but within 6 days, because the whole thing had deteriorated so badly, you had some of the prison guards, they basically said they'd separated themselves into 3 types. There was the tough but fair group. There were the good guys who tried to help them. And then there was others who were like hostile, arbitrary, and inventive in creating humiliating situations and very quite horrible things. They invented this game called Camel, I think, and they made the prisoners simulate having sex with each other in the cell. They were led around the prison environment with sacks on their heads when they were going to go to the toilet. The first thing they did was strip them naked and get rid of all their clothes, and gave them a number, not a name, so everybody called them by their number. Very humiliating. And
did they get their clothes back?
I think they got them back eventually, yeah.
Gosh.
But they had to wear prison uniforms while they were there. And according to Zimbardo, what happened was that his girlfriend, who was a recently qualified PhD sociologist, she saw what was happening and she said, "Look, this is terrible. What are you doing? This is awful." And according to him, she said, "Look, if this is the sort of person you're becoming, I don't want anything to do with you."
Mm.
And he realised at that point that yes, it had gone too far. He admits some mistakes. One of the mistakes was that he played the role of the prison officer. So he
At
played
the
the role
warden.
of the person in charge, the warden, yeah, which he admits he shouldn't have done, because he then became sort of part of the experiment. And when one of them said he was upset and wanted to go home, Zimbardo started to believe that he was just putting it on, and he didn't, um, he was
But the way
behaving like an actual warden.
Well, yeah, because he's made himself part of the experiment,
Yeah,
which you
that's right.
should never do. You should never be
No,
part of your own experiment.
which, to be fair to Zimbardo, he acknowledges.
Mm.
Um,
Poor
and
guy that wanted to leave.
yeah, I
Bit of
mean,
trauma.
well, there's a bit more to that story that we might get
Mm.
time to talk about.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, so that's the bones of it, really. And the conclusions that Zimbardo draws from this is that put people, good people, because these guys were good people, put them in a situation where they are dehumanizing others, create an environment where it's okay to behave that way, and in fact it's encouraged, then what you'll find is that anybody can behave that way. And he's used this sort of analysis to say that we're all capable of doing terrible things. The old question, could anybody become a Nazi? And his answer is yes, because all you need is a situation you're not familiar with, and you end up in that situation. And because of the situation, you find yourself doing things that you wouldn't normally do, and you're capable of doing awful, terrible things. And this isn't an idea that has suddenly come out of nowhere. I mean, I think in popular culture and literature, even I think back to the classic Lord of the Flies, where the kids get shipwrecked on an island and end up becoming savages. Essentially, the whole question about civilization is quite a thin veneer, and when you strip that away, people can behave in some really terrible ways. So I don't think it's completely outlandish, but that's basically the conclusion he comes to. It's really about the situation. It's really about the environment that creates this thing. And he wrote a book on the back of this called The Lucifer Effect,
Right.
which is really describing in more detail what he thinks is happening here. So
Well,
I'll stop talking and see what your reaction is to that.
I guess my initial thoughts are that I suppose it's interesting. So I always think of when this is mentioned, is it the other side of the coin? I don't know. You see what you think with the banality of evil, that book
Mm.
that was written, because I
Hannah
guess his
Arendt.
like, yes, exactly. So she kind of says it's less. I guess it's less that people are like capable of this like wrathful evil, or that it's just it's this mundane evil, I suppose, of just doing being part of the machine of this awful organization. I suppose not directly always doing harm, but it is still doing harm. I guess with him it's the descendants into like the actual evil, like you said, doing enjoying the like power and personally doing it. I suppose that is like, is
Yeah,
that in everybody? Do you know what I mean? Rather, there's, I suppose they're not two sides of a different coin. They're just different levels, I
yeah.
suppose. And it's like, is everyone capable of that level of like,
Mm.
stripping people down and calling them numbers and playing games with them? Do you know what I mean? Versus people that maybe work in some of these awful places, and like you say, that I suppose there's different elements. Like you said, they split into three groups.
Yeah, I
So
was going to
there's,
say that.
I
Yeah, I think
suppose,
I think that's your answer to that question. Is that
yeah.
according to the research, there were three.
Sort of
He split it into three
groups,
sorts, if you like.
subgroups.
Yeah. So you've got the just following orders
Mm.
guards. You've got the people who perhaps really didn't want to be there,
Because there's probably
and
people
there
that were
is.
there literally for the money, which is much like in
Mm,
the real world.
and then you've got the good guys who, although tried to help the prisoners in little ways, they still didn't
Are
stop the
there?
experiment.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So So the question there is, even in...
I mean, you get a bit of a combo potentially of experiments in that sense, where it's like, the electrocution experiment, where they thought they were electrocuting someone, but it's because they're being told to by the psychologist.
Yeah.
And that was a test in itself. But I suppose that's the messiness of this, is that were they going along with it because that's what they would do in a real world scenario, but be bystanders, or is it because they thought, well, I'm in an experiment, I don't want to ruin the experiment, that's not what I'm here to
Celine,
do.
have you ever considered studying psychology? Because you have hit the nail on the head.
I think
Because
I might be all right, but I've used all that money. I said it at the start, media graduate.
that's right, you've done it now. You've done the graduate
Mhm,
thing.
mhm.
Yeah, but no, you're absolutely right. And so I don't know what order to talk about this in a way,
I've
because
given a lot
at,
there, so take it as you like.
yeah, actually the whole thing for me, I wrote down in my notes, Zimbardo is Milgram, which doesn't make any
Yeah,
sense whatsoever. But
but yeah, 100%.
I think you're absolutely right, that actually this is a fascinating study, and it demonstrates coercive control, or at
Mhm,
least power. It demonstrates leadership and lack of it, or how leadership is so powerful and influences, but not the way that Zimbardo thinks it did.
mm,
So the actual results of the so-called experiment are not the ones that are initially talked about and not initially presented.
mhm,
So the recent stuff around this has been that the controversy around this has been that, and I'll sort of try to cut it down into a shorter story as I can. I need to credit the people who have been involved in this process. So there's a French writer called Thibault Le Tézier, who published in French an article, or a book, in fact, cataloguing many of the issues with this experiment. And then there's a journalist called Blum, who Ben Blum,
mm.
who wrote an article that really critiqued this experiment. This is going back a few years now, but it was around the time that I was sort of studying the organizational psychology stuff, I think.
It's
Um,
quite
and
recent.
yeah, and the criticism is what Zimbardo was doing. His actual interest was initially about the prisoners and how the prisoners responded to brutal and inhumane treatment. So actually, he was interested in the prisoners and their response.
Mm,
So when he briefs the prison officers, the people that would play the prison officer role, he was saying to them, we want you to be tough. We want you to be hard. Um, and there's even a recording, because say one thing for Zimbardo, he kept all his workings and he
okay, good.
kept his recordings, which is what you should do in an experiment. And you can actually access this on Stanford's website. And I'm going to put the link to one of the conversations that you can hear
Mm,
with the... I don't know whether it was Zimbardo himself, but it was the instructions that were being given to one of the prison officers playing the role of the prison officer. And basically, he was saying, look, why are you not being hard on these prisoners? And that the guy's saying, well, I don't want to, I don't want to do that. I think this is the problem with prisons and the system of prison systems and stuff. I don't want to be part of that, And he's saying, well, the reason we're doing it is to show that this is what prison does to people. I'm paraphrasing, clearly.
yeah, yeah.
But essentially, this is what the message was. So we need you, in order to get this evidence, in order to show what prison is really like and the effects it has on
You've got to be
people,
part of the
we
problem.
need you to play this role. Um, Now, that's very different to the impression that you get when you first read the prison experiment. When you first read it, what you actually take away from it, I think, is that these prison officers had a change in behavior and a change in personality because of the situation they were put into.
Yeah.
And the situation is what made them do this. But actually, they were instructed to behave in this way. Now, it's clear they weren't told to make the prisoners perform simulated sex acts on each other. That wasn't something that was in the instructions, but
Mm.
it was clear that they had been given clear instruction to be aggressive and to be mean, to be difficult with the prisoners.
Yeah.
And they played that role because they were told to. That was what they were trying to do. As you quite rightly said, part of the pressure was for them to not mess up the experiment.
Mhm.
If the experiment was to see how the prisoners responded, then that would make some sense. But you can't then turn it around and say, actually, we're interested in how the prison officers behaved, not
Yeah.
within the confines of that particular experiment anyway.
From a because obviously I don't necessarily understand the way that experiments are conducted in psychology. So let's say what happened as it did. So,
Mm.
but from a writing a paper sort of ethical, responsible way, are you able to say this is what we set out to do? We didn't do this. However, these were some interesting findings. Is there a way of doing that properly, or do you
So,
say this was interesting, but we need to study it as a proper study? How would you do it properly?
yeah, so I've got a lot to say about that. First of all, before we get to that bit,
Okay.
we have to be clear about the fact that this is not an experiment.
Hmm.
So, although it's called the Stanford Prison Experiment, it is a complete misnomer. It is not an experiment.
What
It
is it?
doesn't
If it's not.
follow. It doesn't follow any experiment I've ever seen.
Okay.
I've ever read about. Certainly, if we were to, as students doing our papers, if we were to do something like that, which ethically, of course, it's appalling. You
It
wouldn't
would
get away with
pass.
it
Yeah.
ethically,
Yeah.
wouldn't pass the ethics board. But even technically, it's not an experiment. So an experiment tests a hypothesis.
Yeah.
Now, I tried to find the hypothesis for this, and I found the best I could find because I couldn't find it in my textbooks. But the Simply Psychology website says that the hypothesis is that the rigid power structure of the prison environment caused prisoners, it would have said would cause prisoners and guards to behave in a hostile manner. So,
Right.
okay, that's your hypothesis. It's too loosey goosey because what does that mean? How are you going to measure that? And so on. But okay,
Let's
let's
say
say
that's
that's the
what that.
hypothesis.
Yeah.
Um, so then what you've got to do is you've got to have a way of testing whether something you do, which is called the independent variable, has some effect on the outcome, which is called the dependent variable. So if I was to say to you, let's do an experiment to see how you receiving good news, whether that has any impact upon your heart rate. So let's say I have a hypothesis that says that receiving good news reduces your heart rate. Okay, that's a hypothesis.
Yep. For
So
sure.
now what I would do is I'd find a way to first of all test what a normal heart rate would be. So I'd give you some neutral news first. So perhaps say, did you know that TV is black?
Mm.
And you say, oh, yes, you're right, it's black. And I'd measure your heart rate on the basis of that. And that would be uh, so your dependent variable is your heart rate. The independent variable is the fact that I'm saying the TV is black.
Mhm.
Then I could manipulate the independent variable, which would be the thing that I'd change. So that could be I've just found out that you're going to get a promotion. So I've changed the independent variable from the TV is black, which is a neutral state, to you're going to get a promotion, which is a good news state.
Mm.
So I've manipulated a very specific thing. And now I'm going to see what happens to that same dependent variable, your heart rate. So I'm going to measure the same thing. And I'm going to be able to see whether the news that you're getting, where there's any evidence that that is having an effect on your heart rate. Now, for one person, you'd say that's not enough to know. So if you do 50 people, let's say, or 100 people, then you're going to be able to see whether statistically speaking, whether good news tends to reduce the heart rate. So that's how experiments work. You have an independent variable which you manipulate, you change, and you have a dependent variable, which is the outcome that you're measuring.
Mm.
There is none of that in this.
No. it's very well, we did this thing, and
Yeah,
talk about
exactly.
it,
We did this thing and we watched it, and we're drawing some
and I've
conclusions.
recorded
So,
it.
and some people call it a case study, but I don't even think in its simplest form. And I'll explain why, in a way, we can call it a case study in a minute. But in its simplest form, this is not a case study, because a case study is something that's happened, and you then investigate the
Yeah,
thing, and you haven't had any part in
like a
setting up the
natural
thing.
occurrence. Like sometimes
Exactly.
with twin studies, you might something will have happened, or like
Yeah.
genetically something's happened, and you're like, oh, right, we can go see if some twins have developed differently, or like things that just happen, and then you can
So
go see.
then that's a bit complicated, because that
Is it
you
not a
can
useful one? Oh no.
no, it's not the best example. A better example would be like a team, or a business that went bust. Well,
Mm,
let's have a look at what happened with that business that went bust.
yeah.
Case study. Um,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
so you're looking at a single case, and you're trying to draw some conclusions from what happened. You interview people, you
Take
listen to
lessons from it.
recordings, you blah 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 blah, and so on. So that's a case study. But that's you've not created the situation there. Whereas in this you have. So the best you can call it, I think, is a study. It is a study of sorts. You've set up a situation that you're now observing, you're watching to see what's going to happen.
Yeah. Mm,
But because you haven't really created any dependent or independent variables, even if you say the dependent variable is that people would behave badly, or
mm,
how would prisoner officers behave towards the prisoners, that's your dependent variable. You haven't got a proper measurement there. You don't know what nasty looks like. You haven't got a measurement of it. So if you're going to do this for real, you'd want to create some sort of scale of bad behavior, and so on. And so you'd want to create some sort of way of measuring it. You haven't got that. You've just got an anecdote of what you saw, and you're describing it,
yeah.
and so on. And so it is not an experiment. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't have any value at all, but it's important to call it what it is. And it's not a goddamn experiment. So we should stop calling it the Stanford prison experiment and call it the Stanford prison study. Maybe we can call it that, because
Yeah.
it's a study.
That
So
stuff that
that's
happened in the prison.
say again.
That stuff that happened in the prison.
That's stuff that happened in the prison, or in the mock-up of the prison.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so that's the first problem.
Mm.
Now, the second thing that I want to address, the point you made, which I've forgotten what it was now. What was it?
He's testing two things. No. So so people wanting to please the experimenter or do what
Ah,
the person in
I think
charge does.
I think that was it. Yeah. So actually,
Milgram.
yeah, Milgram. So it is actually, for me, this is more of an example of a another evidence of Milgram's findings, which itself has got some criticism, but I think at least that is a proper experiment,
Mm,
and it is much more controlled. This is like a case study, if you want to call it that, of Milgram. So it's not a case study in the way that people think it is, but it is a case study in that if you have a professor at a top university saying to you, this is a really important piece of work, this is going to help us to
tenured,
revolutionize.
and that holds weight. He's tenured at that point. So
Tenured, yeah,
yeah.
exactly. This is going to revolutionise the way we treat prisoners, and bear in mind that these were generally quite progressive people, so they would be in the camp of let's not send people to horrible prisons. Um, if you have somebody saying to you, in order for that to happen, you're going to need to do some nasty things and be a bit
Mm.
horrible, because this is the evidence that we're going to be able to present
For the
to
greater
show that
good.
prisons are bad. Yeah,
Mm.
for the greater good, exactly. Um, and so, actually, what we're seeing here is at a different level. We're seeing a study at a different level. So, from our position now, being able to see that experiment in the whole, and let's face it, Zimbardo put himself in the experiment. So, okay, let's get him in there. Then
Mhm.
you cannot be part of the experiment and then create a hypothesis that assumes that you're not part of it. So he is part of it. They encourage the prison wardens to behave in a harsh way towards the prisoners. And if you are saying that the prison guards that were recruited, we successfully weeded out any people with sadism or other qualities that we'd want to select out. If you did that successfully with that pre-work, then you're left with this conclusion that actually what happened here was that it was the authority figures, it was the leadership who created this situation by presenting incentives for people to behave in a way that they wouldn't normally behave. That is a fascinating finding, but it's not the one that is generally talked about, which I think is quite fascinating, really.
Yeah, because it's always just saying, basically, it's to me it's always used in quite a depressing way. It's just basically like people are inherently like everyone's capable of evil, and like it'll all just devolve into evil in the end. Do you know what I mean? And it's kind of like, this is quite depressing.
So
Don't,
that's
yeah.
the other thing that I think is really, it's about time we, how do I say this without sounding really kind of arrogant, but I was going to say it's about time we grew up, really, because it seems to me that society wants it to be either one thing or another. It's either that we shouldn't blame anybody because it's all about the system, which is essentially what a lot of people take from Zimbardo's work, is that it's actually the system that creates this. Anybody could behave that way. It's just the system. Therefore, we need to create systems that don't generate that sort of behavior. So it's all about the system.
Or it's bad
Or
apples.
it's all about the personal accountability, and we
Yeah.
cannot remove personal accountability from the picture. Otherwise, we're just letting people get away with things. And these attitudes tend to sit on the left and right of society. So on the one hand, let's say prisoners' behaviour. So let's look at the prisoners' behaviour now and what they do out in the world to get put into prison in the first place. So on the one hand, often the left is saying, well, what can you expect? These people are in poverty. These people are downtrodden. They don't have any agency. They don't feel like they are part of society. They have no stake in society. So what do you expect? You're going to get people behaving this way.
Right.
And on the other side, you've got people generally on the right who say, well, I grew up in a poor place and I didn't turn out like that. And I know lots of people who don't behave that way. So it's all about personal responsibility. And I just think that's so immature, because clearly the picture is partly both.
It's
There
reductive,
are, of course, individual tendencies, traits. Ultimately, we make a decision for ourselves. But if you've got 100 people, if you create an environment that, as I've just described, no agency, poverty, blah, 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 you're going to get some people who are going to end up behaving in a way that you don't like. So they're both of these two things are factors. And I just find it really frustrating that psychology, as well as popular attitudes, tend to fall into these two binaries, as if it's either one thing or another. Clearly, they're all of these things are part of the picture.
Yeah, I think, and it's not just that some people are in the positions or do the things they do because of circumstance, and some people do the things they do because of it's what they're like or who they are. It's that every person is influenced by both factors, I would say, in that
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
a if you, let's say some people are more they have traits that make them more likely to do X or Y, but if you also grow up in a particular situation, it might add to that versus, or it might take away from that. These things don't
Yeah,
happen in a vacuum.
it's very complicated. So actually, what you've got is um, a combination of things that all come together. So to me, what the study tells us is that people may behave in horrible ways, even going against their natural instincts, if they believe in the desired outcome and are
Yeah.
led in such a way that they can justify it. So there are individual traits and tendencies to behave in certain ways. These individual traits interact with beliefs which include morals and sense of identity of who I am, and also with the situation. So, what's in my best interest, or what meets the goals that I'm trying to achieve. And this all gets mixed up, and you're weighing it up. And also you're looking around to see what other people are doing, because you take cues from the social norms as well. So if everybody else is doing it, you think, well, that's the normal thing we do around here. So all of those things contribute to behavior. And to just imagine it's just one thing, I think, is just too simplistic.
Hi, I'm Tracy.
And I'm Sharon. And we are Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters. So way back in the 1970s, we became radical Christians in the Jesus movement.
We were promoted to leadership in the crazy cult commune Last Days Ministries, founded by none other than Christian music megastar Keith Green.
Now we're sharing our decades-long escape from the trauma and abuse of extreme Christianity.
We tell our own stories and also invite guests to talk about fundamentalism, purity culture, arranged marriages, child abuse, misogyny, homophobia, power-hungry patriarchy, and much more.
Much, much more. So join us as we share our journey of healing and humor, and how we finally found peace and joy on the other side.
Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters, wherever you get your podcasts.
Why do you think it's still something that we go on about this particular experiment so much? Like, there's so many terrible quote unquote experiments from back in psychological time, like back in the day when psychology didn't have the same ethics board that things go through now for its research. Why do you think this is one that we're like hanging on, even though I don't think we're the first people to point out the problems with it? So why is it that we still go back to?
Well, firstly, I think that this is one of the worst examples. So it's true that it was the Wild West out there for quite some time with experiments. But I also think that this is, because it's got a lot of ingredients that are very salacious and very fascinating. You've got students behaving in these terrible ways, these horrible ways, and it mirrors, I suppose, as I said, art. We've all seen heroes in TV and film descend into evil, haven't we? This is even a film trope. You think about Darth Vader, from Anakin Skywalker to Darth Vader. You think about some of the, better than me, some of the ancient and classic works where heroes become villains. Say again?
The Descent of Man.
The Descent of Man, exactly.
Well, just
yeah. This is a very old trope. I mean, even in the Bible, Satan the devil, according to some theology, Jehovah's Witnesses included, he was an angel of light. Satan the devil is actually a good guy to start with, and
a light bringer.
He descends. Yeah. So yeah, this I think it is appealing, and it's also, as I say, it's salacious. It's kind of titillating in many respects. Plus, I think also Zimbardo is a great storyteller, and he tells a very compelling story about it. He's got his girlfriend comes in and tells him that this is terrible, and he's also quite self-deprecating in the fact that he's willing to say, look, I made a mistake there, and this was a problem, which I think is also very appealing. And
he's willing to say that, but he's not willing to say it's not usable. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Yeah. I guess he's trying to validate and say it's okay because I know, and I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, the fact is even some of his critics, some of the critics of the experiment, still use the experiment as a case study, if you like. Probably in many ways that I've just suggested, because I think it's a great case study of what have you got to be careful of when you're designing a study of some sort.
Yeah.
But I think there is something there. There is something happened there. It wasn't an experiment. It didn't have an independent variable. But something happened there. On the surface, civilized, they were all men, which is also interesting. So I think there have been some experiments or some attempts at replication with women, but I don't know of those so well. But anyway, on the face of it, you've got these what seem civilized people put into a situation that is unusual, difficult. They've also been motivated to behave in a certain way, and then they do behave in a way that we would say is out of character for them and quite shocking. One of the cases that Zimbardo helped with as a witness was at the Abu Ghraib military detention center, Abu Ghraib, I think it's pronounced, in Iraq, where some of the US military were abusing and treating very badly the prisoners there, some of them. And they went to trial, and Zimbardo helped on the defense of their behavior to explain that, people do behave in ways that are out of their character. So I think I'm not sure whether I think that's right or not in terms of defending people who did some awful things there. Would you do the same for concentration camp guards? These are very difficult questions, but something did happen, and we can look at it and try to understand. But I think what happened was much more about what Milgram had already suggested, which was about authority and about motivation. Again, in Milgram's study, for those of our listeners that can't remember that, we did talk about that study in detail, so you can look back on that one. But that was the one where he gets people to increase the voltage on a machine they thought they were giving somebody an electric shock in another room for getting the answers wrong. But again, they were convinced that what they were doing was part of a scientific experiment about learning, and they were helping to progress science. So they thought they were doing a good thing in the big picture. So I think that's really what we see with this experiment. But I don't think it shows that put people in a kind of slightly odd situation and they'll start behaving really badly. I don't think, well, it doesn't do that. But what do you think about cults? How does this relate to cults? Because I think it massively does.
Yes. So just before we go into that, I've got one other little. I was just going to ask, do you think there's an element within the psychological community? So it's a weird word to use that for, but you know what I mean, like academic psychological community of like sunk cost, because it's such a, like, if you have to write the whole thing off, it's so awful. Do you know what I mean? If it's like, yeah, we like definitely did some wrong things there, that shouldn't have happened. Do you know what I mean? Like if it was completely not worth it, and you're like, oh, what do we do with that?
On the one hand, you've got a lot of books to rewrite, because every textbook has it in there. But then academics are quite keen on that, because then they get to write more books and sell them. I think there is an element of that. There's an element of we've a lot of people have put a lot of store by this research over the years. I also think that there is something that, and I don't really know the answer to this, and I've hinted at this before, that although the Wild West of psychological experiments was a bad time, there's something about them that meant that they are compelling, and they are very direct in the findings that they get. So the question now is, given the ethics that we all have to obey, and I think it's right that we do that, by the way, but given that, I can't see an experiment like Zimbardo ever happening, even if you were to create it, because you could have created it with a proper hypothesis, dependent variable. If you gave it some thought, you could have designed it in a way that you had proper measurable variables. Or Milgram, that wouldn't be allowed now.
No.
because of the psychological damage it might do to people. But the fact is that without those sorts of experiments, we are left with qualitative studies, people filling out surveys, interviews with people, and they just don't have the same cut through as these good old fashioned, Little Albert, Milgram, Zimbardo,
I wouldn't worry
Darlene
too much.
Latan,
Just
all of these.
just let Netflix make a little docu-series on it, and you'll be fine. You can make it for entertainment these days. There's no ethics committee for the entertainment sphere.
Well, this has happened, as we've talked about. Darren Brown's recreation of the Milgram experiments. He has actually done that. He can do it because he's
doing it for entertainment.
He isn't a scientist. So it's just I think that is part of the difficulty, and this is why these classic experiments have stayed the course, because there is nothing like them anymore.
I suppose
if you want to do that sort of thing, you have to do it in different ways.
And also, I suppose we've got a new realm in terms of psychology that wasn't available to them at that point, with being able to see scans of the brain and get people's responses to things through that, and that's improving all the time. So at the minute, you've got big scanners, but they're creating like hats that you wear and you can just wander around, and it's like basically like a rugby cap kind of thing, and that's all you have to put. So as that improves, it opens a whole new world of
it does, but you can imagine doing a version of the Stanford prison experiment that had a proper experimental design, wearing those caps and measuring people's brain activity. That would be absolutely fascinating. You'd be able to see so much there in terms of how people, but of course, again, you couldn't do it because of discomfort's another one. So the closest you get to causing somebody discomfort is putting their hand in a bucket of ice cold water and measuring people's responses. And so there's been experiments about that, but that's about as much as you can do. So any psychological damage, and I'm not saying that we should be allowed to go on,
damage.
cutting somebody's finger off now and again. What's the problem with that? I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying we should go back to the bad old days, but it is a problem, I think, to some degree, is that it just means that these old experiments still kind of resonate so much with us. Let's go back to the Zimbardo prison experiment. So how does that relate to cults, would you say?
Well, I'll just throw it out there, and then you can, because you thought about this ahead of time. So this is me being asked fresh.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah. So I guess you could do a reading. So remember, I come from the English/media background, so I will say I'll take it as a reading. You could do a reading where you could say that Zimbardo is the cult leader in this scenario, because he's enlisting people into this group, encouraging them to put on new personalities, change their behaviour, modify how they behave, not just the inmates, but maybe even more so the what are they called, officers, prison guards. Even more so, you could say they're really in the cult, because the ones that just get abducted and brought in, I mean, they're kind of just, it's a different kind of control, cultic control. We often talk about coercive control is probably more applicable to the guards, really, because
I agree. Yeah.
So I would say that's kind of how we can run cult ways. Is that where you were going to take this?
It is exactly where I was going with that, and I think it's hard actually not to see that.
Especially, say he's a very charismatic man as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, some people who listen to our podcast might be a bit offended by that, because I know he's quite well loved by some in the community. And, as I say, he is an ally in respect that he talks about cults. I'll put a link to one of his articles on his website about cults and how they operate. And you know what? He's absolutely spot on. He's completely aligned to all the academic research about how cults operate and what they do.
Yeah, he can be an ally, and you can still like things he's done and so on, while still looking at, as we're doing now, we can still look at the things he did and be like, questionable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think, he was never going to become a proper cult leader. Actually, this could be a more fitting legacy in that he found himself in a position where he was trying to do the right thing. In fact, in his article, he actually says that some cult leaders start off trying to do the right thing. They have good motives. They try to start doing the right thing.
My question that I always ask: are you the first member of your own
Of
cult?
your own cult. And I think, I wonder whether he at certain moments he considers that in that scenario that he'd created, he became, for a short period of time, like a cult leader, at least a coercively controlling leader of those prison guards. I agree that the inmates were, we can't learn much from them, I don't think. There's no surprise that treat people badly and they have a very bad mental reaction to that. That's not news to anybody. But that you can get, on the face of it, decent people to behave in horrible ways. Again, it's not like we've never seen that before, but in that situation, I think we can observe it, and that is interesting. And yeah, I think he plays that role of leader of that group, whether we want to call it a cult or coercively controlling situation, getting people to do things that they wouldn't normally do, and as you said, changing their personality, changing the things that they were doing or that they were willing to do. It's hard not to see that.
And it feels like he's probably seen that. Maybe it's not the story he touts because whatever reasons. I mean, man's got to eat. I don't know, but
well,
TED
I
Talks
think he genuinely,
but
yeah.
But he has clearly engaged with the cult space quite a lot, so it feels sort of like it would be strange to imagine that he didn't set on that path or was informed of some of that, or at least thinks about it in relation.
I'd be surprised if he hasn't thought about it. I mean, in terms of cults, this is how cults operate. This is why they target all of the factors that we mentioned. Really, they try to shape people's sense of self. So they, put on the new personality, be theocratic, change people, change their attitudes, change their beliefs about the world, and their beliefs about how to achieve those laudable goals that they want to see. They also create this tight-knit community with plenty of peer pressure, this social norm, to reinforce the behavior they want, including punishment for those not complying. When you hear the conversation with the guard that wasn't doing it the way they wanted to, it's clear they're really putting pressure on him to do it properly. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. So yeah, this is how cults operate. So if we look at it like that, then the Stanford prison experiment becomes a really interesting case study, just not the one that we thought it was.
Experiment.
Yeah.
Nice. I think, to be honest, we've done this quite a good job. I didn't know what ride we were going to go on. I think this has been quite good. I've had a good time. I mean,
I have too. Found that very, very interesting. Okay, cool. Before we go, just want to remind our listeners about Witness Underground. We're really trying to get people to, visit the website. So if you type Witness Underground into the search engine, you'll go straight to the Kickstarter campaign. So this is Scott and his colleagues who've created this film. We interviewed Scott and Ryan and others in the past, and we've also, in the bonus episode, which as I'm recording this will be on Wednesday. By the time you hear it, it will have been on Wednesday. So check that out if you've not heard it yet. And if you want to support these guys, it'd be great because it's a really good thing to do. So don't forget to do that. What do we want people to do for us, Celine?
Leave a review. I sounded so
Please leave
like
a review.
so
You sounded so
downtrodden.
pathetic. Yeah,
It's
leave
just,
a review.
leave a review. I just don't
Please leave a
understand. Why are
review.
you not doing it? I'll guilt you. I'm so sad. Yeah, go on.
Leave it.
Just
A
leave
good
a
one,
review.
obviously. Only a good one. Leave a
Yeah,
review. That would be lovely.
you can
And
just. I mean, just say it. I mean, if you're struggling, just say something about this episode. Some people,
yes.
they get them to do that. They get them to just comment as reviews. Do that. Go on.
Yeah, but only if you like it. Obviously, we don't want any bad
Yeah.
reviews.
5 stars. I'll dictate. So 5 stars.
Yeah, and actually say something. That's maybe people are giving reviews, but they're not saying anything. It matters a big deal if you say something.
Say how
even if
funny
it's
we
only
are. Obviously very charismatic. Great leaders. No.
No, don't think
No.
Right, okay, I'm going to go now. You've just finished work, so
I'm gonna have a curry.
Let's call it an evening. And thank you very much, listeners, for listening to Cult Hackers. See you again next week. Bye.
Bye.